The invasion should not have occurred, but was provoked. This is the crucial point many people do not understand or do not want to understand. Sooner or later, Russia would have to take drastic measures because the neocons don't negotiate, period. The neoconservative modus operandi is always my way or the highway. The neocons devised a plan to destroy and divide Russia. They were so obsessed with it that they did not even consider the possibility of Russia and China becoming allies, which is precisely the reality Brzezinski warned the US should prevent rather than incite. The European Parliament elections are approaching, and European citizenry should create a trans-European political movement capable of deconstructing the European Commission's intention to transform the European economy into a war economy based on the assumption that Germany and Europe must prepare for war with Russia. The current European leadership is not capable of admitting defeat. Therefore, it must continue to impose and reconcile contradictory narratives, on the one hand, a victorious Ukraine, and on the other hand, Putin's intention to rebuild the Soviet Empire, which explains why Russia is a threat to the security of Europe as a whole. Suppose Europeans believe that Europe should continue to escalate the war instead of negotiating with Russia, imagining having Putin's head served on a silver platter as a prize. In that case, they better get ready for a nuclear holocaust. European citizens still living in the real world must take this threat seriously. We cannot expect common sense or goodwill from the current European leadership, driven by the desire for absolute domination rather than a balance of power. The war in Ukraine showed that, after all, the king is naked and is not as gifted as imagined. The emerging multipolar order is challenging the rules-based international order, and the frustration of the Western leadership has never reached such a high level, inducing the insane desire for revenge. In addition to economic, geopolitical, and geostrategic interests, the neoconservative horde is driven by delusional hubris, which can lead to political and military decisions whose consequences may not even allow us to regret it. It seems to me that it makes little sense to repeat ad nauseum that Putin illegally invaded Ukraine, and it is useless and counterproductive to label Putin a monster, as so many people who call themselves leftists do every time they talk about negotiations or defend the end of the war. Firstly, it is the European political elite that must be replaced because it is a complete absurdity to turn Russia into a permanent enemy. Secondly, 110 million, 80% of the 144 million Russians live in the European part of Russia, the country with the largest population in Europe. Thirdly, only delusional hubris, ignorance, bad faith, and intentional vilification can explain the denial of the Russian contribution to science, art, literature, and music of collective European culture. Russia is part of Europe, and we cannot allow the neocons to impose the single narrative painting the Russians as barbarians to convince us of the need for an arms race and the readiness for war with the evil Putin as the only possible alternative to guarantee European security. We must be open to discussing whether Europe should have a joint army, strengthen national armies, or a mix of both, or whether Europe should become a federation. There should be no taboo subjects as long as they pass democratic scrutiny. Humanity must choose the path of demilitarization and create truly democratic international institutions that prevent militarization. Imperialism and the influence of the mic and the deep state on politics must end, whether through revolving doors, funding electoral campaigns, corruption, clientelism, etc. NATO should be dissolved rather than expanded. There are many good reasons to do so. However, it is always possible to convince people of the opposite. We should be skeptical, to say the least, of allowing the European bureaucracy to implement the militarization of the EU under the pretext of the Russian threat, bypassing democratic scrutiny. It will be a blessing for the armaments industry and beyond. Dr. Christian Merling, https dgap origin user 18.346, and Torben Schutz, https dgap origin user 23.269. Advocate the rearmament of Germany and NATO to avoid the next war, https dgap origin research publications preventing next war, Editor Roman 3. Act in support of ammunition production ASAP https Defense Industry Space Europa UU Defense Industry Act Support Ammunition Production ASAPN. Perhaps Ursula von der Leyen wants to transform the EU into a world leader in producing environmentally sustainable weapon systems as part of the transition to a green economy. A warning. We better become aware of the dangers lurking to realize how imperative it is to prevent the militarization of Germany in particular and Europe in general before it becomes an irreversible reality. Negotiations and peace agreements, economic and strategic cooperation. Russia is part of Europe, and the neocons won't be able to erase this reality. If there is true democracy, international justice, and accountability, mistakes can be righted, and intentional manipulation can be exposed and punished. The responsibility to choose the future we want is ours. Democracy is much more than delegating responsibilities to third parties. This error is fatal to democracy and collective well-being. What is the point of creating a permanent enemy of a nation that should be a vital partner? And last, but not least, follow the money.